The following episode contains descriptions of violence and is not suited to all listeners. Viewer discretion is advised. For confidential support, please contact your local crisis centre.
Born on the 20th of May 1903, Antonio Agostini was an Italian migrant born in a Venetian province and a waiter who immigrated to Australia in 1927. He moved to live in Sydney, Australia, and in 1928 he met a woman by the name of Linda Platt, who had emigrated from London via New Zealand. In 1928, Linda was working as a cinema usher where she had met Antonio. Linda returned to England in 1929 and then returned back to Australia in 1930, where she would marry Antonio. Their marriage waxed and waned, and according to Antonio, Linda was a heavy drinker. They eventually moved from Sydney to Melbourne, where a man by the name of Antonio Agostino, not related, said Agostini used to live opposite him in Swanston Street in Carlton, Melbourne. In speaking to the Telegraph, Agostino said that he thought Agostini was a representative of an Italian newspaper in Sydney. Quote, "Because of the similarity of our names, people used to call him at my shop. Among the callers were agents for an Italian paper. I only knew that he disappeared suddenly." In the August of 1934, Linda Platt had vanished. Antonio Agostini worked as a waiter in Sydney until March 1944, where he was subsequently arrested on the 6th of March for his wife's murder. Commissioner McKay interviewed Agostini, where he was then driven to How Long Road in Albury, where the woman's body was found almost 10 years prior. After the trip, police and Agostini returned to Melbourne, where he was charged with murder. Police guarded the body of the woman at the city morgue until the courts dealt with the case. An armed constable started guard duty at 10 p.m, watching over the specially built wooden box that was 6 foot long and 2 feet 6 inches wide. The box containing her body was so heavily lined that, quote, "it took 4 men to carry it into the building." In a strange turn of events, on March 8th, it was announced by state newspapers that the city coroner, Mr. Tingate, would be going ahead with the, quote, "Pyjama Girl inquest, which would be held in Melbourne." This inquest would be separate from the subsequent criminal trial of Antonio Agostini. On the 12th of March 1944, a, quote, "forlorn-looking little man stepped into the Melbourne City Court. With both hands in his pockets, he faced the magistrate. As the charge was read out, the jam-packed courtroom fell silent. Sergeant Herbert Cordy began to read, quote, "You are charged with having murdered your wife, Linda Agostini, 28, at your home in Swanston Street, Carlton, on or about August 26, 1934. Agostini said, nor did nothing. His neck was collarless, and his belt and tie had been removed. His small Charlie Chaplin moustache had been recently clipped. He wore heavy, horn-rimmed spectacles." Police Inspector Ainsworth said to Magistrate McLean, quote, "As you are no doubt aware, this case is well known as the Pyjama Girl murder. It occurred 10 years ago, and after inquiries were made by New South Wales and Victorian detectives, Agostini was questioned on Saturday and was charged yesterday with that crime." Agostini was then remanded to appear at the City Court on March 15th. With hands still in his trousers, he left the courtroom, and a week later, he appeared again before the City Court, where his application for bail was refused. As Mrs. Jeanette Rutledge was made aware of the arrest and charge, together with Dr. Benbow Palmer, they wrote a letter to the police commissioner claiming the body once again. On the 17th of March 1944, Mrs. Rutledge stated that Dr. Palmer, who has previously been heavily involved with the case of the Pyjama Girl's identity, has, quote, "fresh material to support his theory that the woman's body was that of Anna Philomena Morgan and not of Mrs. Agostini." With Antonio Agostini still remanded in jail, the inquest into the identity of the Pyjama Girl began in one of Melbourne's former coroner's courts on Batman Avenue on Thursday, March 23, 1944. Melbourne had a long and sordid history regarding the collection and subsequent storage of the deceased. In the early days of the colony, bodies were stored in local hotels until examined by the coroner. In response to community need, primitive morgues were built near the Prince's Bridge and on a wharf yard on the side of the Yarra. The morgue on the wharf happened to predate comparable institutions such as New York City's first morgue opened in 1866 on the grounds of Bellevue Hospital near the East River. However, the morgues were badly lit and unsewered, meaning drainage from the bodies awaiting examination would flow straight into the Yarra River. Finally, after years of bureaucratic red tape and shifts of responsibility, a new morgue was built on Batman Avenue on the edge of South Bank, where the Pyjama Girl inquest would eventually take place. In a statement prepared for the coroner, detectives put forward a list of more than 35 witnesses, including Dr. Benbow and Mrs. Routledge. Entering the inquest, Antonio Agostini, still technically in custody and wearing a large button-up waistcoat and smoking a cigarette, was escorted by 3 detectives into the hearing. During the hearing's first day, most evidence came from Sydney detectives and several witnesses alleging the woman was Linda Agostini, formerly known as Linda Platt. One witness, Sydney dentist William Joseph O'Brien, said that he gave professional treatment to Mr. Agostini on November 12, 1930. Agostini brought his wife with him to the surgery. O'Brien said that he had seen the body of the Pyjama Girl, and as clearly as he could remember, he believed it was the body of Mrs. Agostini. He then further described the dental work he had done on several teeth for Linda Agostini, which included 2 porcelain fillings. However, when asked about the body's porcelain fillings, O'Brien refused to swear that the fillings had been conducted by him, and only that, quote, "I say it is the type of work I do." A former cinema usherette, a Mrs. Doreen Dunn, was also called into the hearing. Quote, "I was employed at Hoyt's Theatre, George Street, in 1927. Linda Platt called at the theatre in search of a position. Another usherette, Sadie Cole, and I befriended Linda and took her home. Later, she came to work at the theatre as an usherette. Linda had a piece out of the side of both ears, and she would make this joke and say, 'That is where the monkey bit me.' On March 4 this year, she had examined the body on the roof of a police headquarters. Mr. Reed, speaking for the coroner, quote, 'As a result of that examination, what did you say?' Quote, 'I say it is Linda Platt or Mrs. Agostini, definitely.' At the outset of the trial, Mr. Barry, who was acting for Mrs. Jeanette Rutledge, requested that police call 6 witnesses from New South Wales, whom he believed could positively identify the body as that of Anna Morgan. A Mr. W.A. Fazio, the lawyer for Agostini, challenged the power of the coroner to proceed with the inquest. He argued that the coroner had no jurisdiction over a body found in New South Wales. The coroner, Mr. Tingate, rejected his submission and adjourned the hearing. At the resumption of the inquest, Dr. Leslie Samuel Woods of Albury said he examined the woman's body in the culvert in 1934. There were compound fractures of the skull and the brain was crushed and contused. A subsequent examination led to the extraction of a bullet in the neck. He believed the body had been put in a bag before rigor mortis had set in. Death, in his opinion, was due to severe head injuries and laceration of the brain. He could not say for certain whether the head injuries or the bullet caused death, but he said, quote, "The heavy blows could not have been self-inflicted." After several testimonies, it was then adjourned to the following Monday.
If you love our episodes and would like to hear more, we appreciate your support over on Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can help us keep doing what we love and create episodes you love to listen to. Find us on patreon.com/Ezra Magazine.
By Sunday the 26th of March 1944, the inquest into the Pyjama Girl's death was one of several court cases covering the front pages of newspapers around Australia. According to several newspapers published at the time, Charlie Chaplin, best known for his comedic sketches, became embroiled in a court case involving an alleged case of trafficking and paternity issues. Chaplin was accused of transporting a woman by the name of Joan Barry to New York and back to Los Angeles for, quote, immoral purposes. In regards to the Pyjama Girl case, New South Wales Police Commissioner McKay was to fly to Melbourne from Sydney to give evidence at the inquest, which would resume the following day. According to McKay, Antonio Agostini made a statement to McKay inside the restaurant where Agostini worked before he was charged with murder. This would later become vital in Agostini's trial. Since the Pyjama Girl's body had been transported to Melbourne 3 weeks prior, detectives started searching the muddy bed of the Yarra River, which is the main river stretching through the heart of Melbourne. They were looking for a pistol. Believed to be the weapon used to murder the woman, police surmised that the murder weapon had been thrown from a bridge after the discovery of the woman's body almost 10 years prior. It was revealed in the inquest that Agostini was given the pistol by some relatives in 1927 before immigrating to Australia. He had called into Central Police Station in Sydney to register it. However, he was told, quote, he could not do this, so throw it into the harbour, referring to the Sydney harbour. Detective Latrobe said they accompanied Agostini to the Morell Bridge across the River Yarra in Melbourne. Midway across the bridge, Agostini said, quote, this is where I threw it. On Monday, March 27, 1944, the alleged details of the murder were finally revealed to the inquest. New South Wales Police Commissioner McKay, speaking at the inquest, alleged that Antonio Agostini confessed to the Commissioner in Sydney. The woman was murdered as the result of a, quote, accident, following an attempt by her to shoot him while he was sleeping beside her. The alleged statement by Agostini, read to the inquest, said that he took the body enclosed in a sack to Albury by road at night, put it into a culvert, poured petrol over her, and set it alight. The following is a direct transcript from the Melbourne inquest, where Commissioner McKay reads the alleged statement from Antonio Agostini. The realization that she was dead gave me a terrible shock and unbalanced my mentality. For a long while, I was staring at her, failing to put my thoughts together. It was long after the full realization of what had happened that its consequences came fully to my mind. My first thought was of going to report to the police, and I was making myself presentable for going out. While doing so, I could not dress for thinking of what had happened, and I would sit down in the middle of dressing to think of what I could do and what had caused the trouble. By the time I had got dressed and downstairs, I started to see what would happen to my friends, my relations, and the firm with whom I was employed when the big headings would come out in the paper about the shooting. In the work I was doing, I had made a lot of friends in the Italian and Australian communities in Melbourne, and I felt that I was highly regarded by them all. The thought of what they would think of me swayed my better judgment of telling the police straight away, particularly that my action would ruin the enterprise I was connected with, and which I was keenly interested in, and had started to build up a strong newspaper of the Italian sort. I sat down in my office, and after what may have been hours, I came out of the confusion, and I felt like I could not let my action hit a blot on the Italian community. Although I had nothing to do with firing of the weapon, I felt there would be suspicion on me. By this time, so much time had passed that I felt that if I went to the police and told the truth, they would look on me with suspicion and would not believe me. When I came to my decision to do my utmost to hide traces of the happening in the death of my wife, I decided to dispose of the body by taking it to some part of the country. At 8 p.m. on the day of the accident to my wife, I left Melbourne with the body and took the highway to Albury. I had no plans. I was just running. I continued on, and I realised by the lights I saw that I was nearing Albury, because it was a large town, so I took the first branch road I met, and after travelling for some time, I stopped the car at a quiet part of the road where there was little bridge or a culvert. I had taken with me some extra petrol in a tin because I knew that it was late at night and I might have difficulty in waking anyone up at the garage to get a fresh supply. So I poured some of the petrol from the tin onto a bag which the body was enclosed and placed the body under the bridge and set fire to it by lighting it with a match. Light rain was falling at the time, and I immediately got into my car, put the balance of petrol into the tank of my car, and drove back the same road to Melbourne. I garaged my car in front of my house where I was in the habit of leaving it. As soon as I arrived back in Melbourne, I went to the grocer's shop of Mr. Castellano 2 doors away in Swanston Street, Carlton. I remembered he asked me how I got a scratch which was on the side of my head. It was a cut which I received in the struggle with my wife the previous morning, which had dried blood on my cheek. The cut was inflicted by the side of a revolver when I was struggling to get possession of it from my wife on the bed. I told him that the cut had been caused by the door of my car, and he remarked how dreadful I looked. Mrs. Castellano got coffee, and I had coffee and biscuits or bread. I then returned to my own home, and I was in a dreadful nervous state. I did not work, but just lay about for 2 days. A couple of days afterwards, Castellano came to see me as he was worried because I did not call at his place as I usually do, practically every day. He remarked that I was not looking my old self, and asked me if I would like to go out for a short run with a car. I said I would like to go, and I got my car. While in the car, he asked me about where my wife was, and he told me that the photographs of the Albury victim looked remarkably like my wife Linda. I then confessed to him that she had been accidentally killed while she was struggling for a revolver. I told him all that I have put into this statement. He then told me my wife was a whiskey fiend and she had developed into taking cheap wine from some sly grog shop near Swanston Street, and he had noticed a change in her outlook, and by her conduct she was going downhill through drink. I told him of what I had done and my reason for doing so, as set out in this statement that I am making now, and said, I think it is better that I go to the police because I cannot carry on. The statement continues to allege that his wife Linda had threatened to kill him several times and that their relations had become more and more unhappy, mainly due to her, quote, drinking habits. By 1933, a year before the alleged murder took place, the couple decided to move to Melbourne for a fresh start and to, quote, get away from the evil influence and temptations of a circle of friends in Sydney. However, their hope for change did not materialise. On several occasions, Linda allegedly left Antonio because she, quote, understood the harm she was doing by him. On or around August 28, 1934, Mr. Agostini and his wife went to bed in preparation for a trip to Shepparton the following morning. Mr. Agostini's statement continued as follows. I had a restless night, and as I had on many nights previously, but towards the break of the day I fell into a sound sleep and awakened at the start when the alarm went off at 7 o'clock and felt something hard pressing into my head behind the left ear. I realised it was a gun she was holding against my head, and I quickly turned my head on the cushion and grasping her hand in my hand, I commenced to struggle with her for possession of the revolver, intending to disarm her. In doing so, we rolled over on the bed. She struggled bitterly and was very determined. She surprised me with her strength. We rolled over in the bed and I felt she was going to let go of the revolver because her hand relaxed. The next thing I heard was a shot going off. She gave a long gasp and ceased to struggle. The realization that she was dead gave me a terrific shock. For a long while, I was staring at her, failing to put my thoughts together. I intended to go to the police and come back. I did not know what I was doing for hours and hours. She got the marks when I was taking her down to put her in the car, and I fell down when I was going down the stairs. Agostini then describes the ordeal with her body, saying that he tripped over the carpet at the top of the stairs, and when he took the body down, it was limp and heavy. He alleges that there were no marks on the head before he left the bedroom, and no marks he could remember after the struggle on the bed. He'd put a towel around her head to stop the bleeding from her right ear. He put the body in the potato sack outside, and then put her into the car. Agostini alleges that she started bleeding from the head where she fell down the stairs and that her head was badly smashed. He then drove along the main road to Albury and disposed of the corpse. The alleged statement then continues to proclaim blackmail was used against him by Castellano, an alleged member of the Camorra Society and the grocer who lived on the same street as him. The Camorra is an Italian mafia-type criminal organisation and criminal society originating in the region of Campania. It is one of the oldest and largest criminal organisations in Italy, dating to the 17th century. Agostini's statement continued, quote, "A legal action was brought in Melbourne against the Italian newspaper I was then working for, and I was called as a witness. I only then realised that Castellano had befriended me previously so that when he could use the opportunity and hold me in his clutches. As my presence in this case was of paramount importance, I was threatened by the Castellano that if I appeared in court, he would denounce me for the accident that I related to him, which he had prevented me from telling the police about. As I knew by then who Castellano was, and that he was the leader of the Camorra Society, I determined to come out in the open and I told him to go ahead, and that I was not afraid of him. I went to court and gave my depositions in spite of the threats I received up to the last moment, even in the very courtyard of the court." Between the statements, detectives revealed that Castellano has since died. Sergeant McKay said the statement by Agostini was made voluntarily to him. Mr. McKay said that the statement had been completed and typed on March 4, 1944 by Constable Linkenbach. Mr. McKay said that after the statement had been completed and typed, Agostini read it over, initialed a number of alterations, and then signed it. After the statement was read out loud at the inquest, Mr. Fazio, the acting lawyer for Agostini, began questioning Sergeant McKay. Mr. Fazio: "Have you known Agostini for some time?" Mr. McKay: "Yes, since 1928 or 1929. I did not know him as Agostini, I just knew him as Tony. He was in charge of the cloakroom at Romano's." Mr. Fazio: "You knew he was at Romano's restaurant when you got in touch with him by telephone, correct?" "Yes," he replied. "You sent a message that you would like to see him?" "Yes." "He had a conversation with you in your office and nobody else was there?" "That is so." "Was the effect of that conversation that you told him he did not have the same cheery look about him and something had appeared to upset him?" Mr. McKay: "I said, 'Now look, Tony, you appear to be a worried man. You do not appear to be the same smiling Tony I knew way back in 1930 at Romano's.'" The case was adjourned the following day. With the war still raging in Europe, the Pyjama Girl case took over headlines and almost reprieve from news of Europe burning. Melbourne and Sydney were abuzz with public musings of the case and the question as to whether the body was that of Anna Philomena Morgan or that of Linda Agostini. Between 1940 and 1949, there were over 1,000 mentions of the case in newspapers of the time. Tasmania, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, Sydney, the Northern Territory were all following the case closely. The main issue with the case was the lack of forensic technology available during the decades of 1930 and 1940, described by the Australian Institute of Criminology in 1990 as a powerful breakthrough in forensic science. DNA profiling wouldn't become available to investigators until the late 1980s. In the United States, the public sector began to conduct forensic DNA tests late in 1988, starting with the FBI laboratory and followed by various states such as Virginia and New York. After profiling rapidly gained popularity, Britain adopted the technology in 1985 along with Switzerland and Germany. However, it wasn't until the October of 1987 where British courts used DNA evidence for the first time against a man accused of rape. Initially referred to as DNA profiling, private companies at the time claimed their techniques of analysis had, quote, "the power to identify one individual in the world's population," and that the chance that any two people would have the same DNA print was 1 in 30 billion. Furthermore, the PCR or polymerase chain reaction method, which is the very same method your saliva or nose contents would be analysed through for traces of COVID-19, was still in the experimental stage in the 90s. In the Pyjama Girl case, Limited forensic evidence and tools meant that investigators were relying on forensic odontology to confirm the identity of the woman. Human dentition, or the structure of the human mouth, is heterodont or diphodont. For humans, heterodont means we possess more than a single tooth structure in our jaw, which are our incisors, our canines, premolars, and molars. Diphodonty represents the 2 generations of functional teeth we experience in our lifetime. When we're growing as children, we grow 20 deciduous teeth and then grow 32 permanent teeth as adults. The uniqueness of the structure of our mouths is routinely used as identification evidence in forensic odontology, which is the scientific study of the structure and diseases of teeth. The uniqueness of human dentition remains unproved. However, during a humanitarian disaster such as a flood, landslide, or cyclone or other natural event, forensic odontology and forensic science combine together in an attempt to identify victims and provide an age estimation. Forensic odontology is regarded in literature as one of the most reliable and economical scientific methods for victim identification in mass disasters. According to the Disaster Victim Identification Guide, quote, "If a positive match is found using dental identification, it can be trusted as a standalone identifier. Dental structures are well protected and the hardest structure of the body. They resist decomposition and high temperatures and are the last one to disintegrate after death. Dental hard tissue provide abundant information in disaster victim identification, missing and unidentified persons, child abuse, neglect, domestic violence, and sexual abuse." One study published in 2018 conducted a comprehensive search of literature databases to systematically review the role of forensic odontologists in various global mass disasters. The maximum number of victims was associated with the Japan tsunami, which was 15,892, followed by the Thailand tsunami, 4,280, and the Estonia ferry disaster, 852. However, the success of identification of human remains relies much on antemortem or pre-death dental records. Dental records would become the topic of the inquest into her identity the following day due to Dr. Benbow and Mrs. Routledge's claims that the body belonged to that of Anna Philomena Morgan. John James Morgan of 5 Dock said that in about 1908 in Johannesburg, South Africa, he met a woman of Dutch parentage named Anna Brits. Anna Brits had a daughter from a previous relationship whose name was not Jeanette, but Johanna, which is the lady in this episode referred to as Mrs. Routledge. John and Anna married in New South Wales, and sometime after 1911, Johanna, Anna's daughter, gave birth to a female child and returned home with the child to live with Anna and John. The child was known as Phil, who would eventually be known as Anna Philomena Morgan. Phil, according to John Morgan, would have been 14 or 15 since he had last seen her. It was revealed in the inquest that John Morgan had inspected a body at the morgue the day of the inquest and, quote, "I should swear," he said, "and I know that girl better than anybody, including her mother. That is not Phil." Another witness called to the inquest, dental surgeon Leonard Bell, said that in 1923, a girl named Philomena Morgan came to live in the district with Mrs. Corey, a personal friend of his. In the early part of 1923, Mrs. Corey brought Philomena Morgan to him as a patient. The girl appeared to be about 11 or 12. She made 6 or 7 visits to his surgery during a period of 14 days. He found that the right upper first permanent molar and the right lower first permanent molar were decayed, and they were extracted at the first visit. A 6-year-old molar in the left lower jaw was badly abscessed, and over a period of 6 or 7 visits, the abscess was drained and the tooth then extracted. From his personal recollection of the girl, from his knowledge of the dental work he had done, and from a close examination of the body at the morgue today, he considered that it was the body of the Philomena Morgan. He told the inquest that after viewing the body in the morgue, the extractions and dental work of Anna Philomena Morgan were identical with the gaps in her mouth of the deceased woman. Shown a model of the teeth of the Pyjama Girl, Bell said the condition revealed on the lower left gum was consistent with the abscessed area in Philomena Morgan's mouth. However, upon cross-examination, Mr. Reed, acting for the coroner, questioned Dr. Bell, revealing that he kept no records of dental work and saw an average of 180 patients a week for 21 years. The inquest was once again adjourned to the following day. 6 days into the inquest, mounting speculation as to whether the body belonged to Anna Philomena Morgan or Linda Agostini was the talk again of every newspaper in Australia. After a failure of police to catch both the murderer and identify the woman, suspicions were raised around the investigation procedures and Sergeant McKay's familiarity with Antonio Agostini, having known each other since 1929. Commissioner McKay, who lunched at the famous restaurant every day, and who, once the incriminating facts were known, extracted a personal confession from the suspect, apparently with little difficulty. However, the inquest proceeded as planned on Wednesday, March 29, 1944, now just over 3 weeks since Antonio Agostini was arrested for the murder of the Pyjama Girl. On the Wednesday, 3 witnesses testified in the inquest that the body belonged to that of Anna Philomena Morgan. Benjamin Griffin, a storeman from Blackheath in New South Wales, said that between 1926 and 1929, he and his wife lived at 5 Dock with Mr. John Morgan, Anna Philomena Morgan's grandfather by marriage. A girl called Phil or Phyllis Morgan made periodic visits to the house, according to Griffin. However, he could not recall seeing the woman since 1929, when she was about 18. In 1937, detectives showed him official photographs of the Pyjama Girl, where he indicated one of the photographs resembled that of Phyllis Morgan. Continuing in his statement, he had viewed the body at the city morgue the previous day, and quote, "I believe it is the same body I identified in Sydney," he said. "I consider the body has changed quite a lot since then. It is discoloured and appears to be plumper." Mr. Barry, acting for Mrs. Rutledge, produced a signed statement from Benjamin Griffin, made in 1937 to the coroner, confirming what he said to the coroner. When asked whether he simply glanced at the body, or in fact examined it properly, Griffin replied, quote, "I realised the seriousness of the task and gave it my full consideration. I think Detective Wills said it was a good identification." Another witness, a proprietress of an employment agency called Mrs. Blackett, spoke to the inquest about a girl who came to her on August 7, 1934, less than 1 month before a woman's body would be found in Albury. Miss Blackett said that she had advertised for a housemaid's job in Henty, a town approximately 68 kilometres north of Albury, and on August 7, a woman arrived at her premises in an agitated state of mind. The girl admitted she was not a housemaid, but wanted to be sent on the job anyhow, as she wanted to get to Albury. Furthermore, the woman refused to tell Miss Blackett who she was and why she wanted the job. With the woman refusing to tell the witness anything, Miss Blackett explained that without references, she was unable to do anything about the job application. Upon realizing the situation, the distressed woman cried bitterly and was with the witness for just under 2 hours. However, Miss Blackett could not obtain any information from her. At last, the woman stood up, walked out of the door with tears running down her face, and said, "You'll always regret you did not send me," and walked out of the premises. Quote, "If I have to walk, I will go," referring to the town of Albury. Miss Blackett said that she had been in business for 12 to 15 years and in the course of a day saw dozens of girls. However, she remembered the girl because of the quote, "sorrow" of this girl. A photograph taken at the Albury morgue was the girl who had come asking for the job in 1934. 5 or 6 weeks after the body had been discovered, she was taken to Sydney University to see the body in the formaldehyde bath. Quote, "It was definitely the girl who came to my office," she said. In about 1940, Dr. Palmer Benbow of Sydney came to see her and showed her a photograph similar to that produced. She recognised it as the girl who came to see her, except for a gap in the teeth. The girl's hair, visible under her hat, was a light brown and her eyes were blue-grey. She was a pretty girl with a nice mouth and turned-up nose. Another witness called Natal Zumo from Darlinghurst in Sydney testified that he knew both Linda and Mr. Agostini as he shared a flat with Antonio whilst his wife was away in England. Testifying at the inquest, Mr. Zumo stated that Dr. Palmer Benbow came to see him this year after he had read that Agostini had been arrested. Dr. Benbow showed him a photo of the deceased woman, asking if he recognised Mrs. Agostini. Quote, "I said I could not see Mrs. Agostini in these photos at all." Mr. Zumo also provided a statutory declaration that the woman was not Linda Agostini due to, quote, "a number of physical differences." In support of Mr. Zumo's assertion that the body was not that of Linda Agostini's, a woman by the name of Mrs. Mary Callow from New South Wales said that in February of 1932 she let a flat to a Mr. and Mrs. Coots. Mrs. Coots, the witness said, asked her to call her Anna Philomena Morgan on a piece of paper, saying, quote, "That was my name before I was married." Around August of 1934, the month prior to the body being found, Mrs. Callow said that she met Philomena at Darlinghurst. Distressed, Philomena said, quote, "I am in terrible trouble. My husband has gone to Melbourne and taken practically all my money. I want to go after him as soon as I can." After the witness read about the body being discovered at Albury in early September, she recognised the woman in the photo and went straight to the police. After her statement, Mr. Reed, the coroner's assistant, then asked the witness to step out of the witness box and view the body of the deceased woman. When she returned, she claimed the body was that of Mrs. Coots, aka Anna Philomena Morgan. Mrs. Callow then handed the detectives a badly stained and tattered coat, saying, to the best of her belief, the coat belonged to the deceased woman. The following day, nearing towards the end of the trial, Dr. T.A. Palmer Benbow took the stand. Benbow was the doctor infatuated with the case and who took it upon himself, on behalf of Mrs. Routledge, to investigate whether the body belonged to the daughter. Benbow, under questioning from the coroner, produced 2 transparency images, one belonging to the Pyjama Girl and one belonging to Anna Philomena Morgan. To the naked eye, they were a, quote, "perfect match." The coroner adjourned the inquest immediately to the uproar from the public gallery, where he, quote, "instructed the police to produce floodlights in the city morgue so that the photographs could be examined the following Monday." When the court resumed, Dr. Benbow continued his testimony, commenting on the anatomical structures of the body and the 2 women concerned. Quote, "Mrs. Agostini's nose was a pessimistic type, utterly different from the nose on the corpse." He then produced 7 photos of the corpse taken at various angles in 1939. Holding 2 full-face photos to the coroner, Dr. Benbow said Mrs. Agostini had a, quote, "wide, even-angled mouth." Quote, "When Mrs. Agostini smiled, she smiled with an even movement of the lips. This was not so in the mouth of the corpse," he continued. "In the corpse, this little twist smile had set in death in one corner of her mouth." To support his claim, Dr. Benbow produced 4 photographs of Anna Philomena Morgan. All 4 showed the little smile evident in the photo of Anna Philomena Morgan. Most importantly, the question arose around her eye colour. Linda Agostini's eyes were a dark brown. The corpse was, quote, "blue-eyed." In response, Dr. Benbow claimed that he had never heard of a corpse's eyes turning blue-eyed in death. Quote, "That would be quite impossible." By the 9th day of the inquest, tensions increased between the coroner's team, detectives, Mrs. Routledge lawyers, and Dr. Benbow. After having been in the witness box for almost 3 days, Dr. Benbow became restless and slightly impatient with the coroner's team, including Mr. Reed. By 4 p.m, the court was adjourned once again. On its 10th day, on the 6th of April 1944, exactly 1 month after Agostini was arrested, New South Wales Detective Sergeant A.A. Wilkes presented some evidence and submitted himself for questioning. The woman's eyes once again came into question, remembering that Mrs. Linda Agostini's eyes were described as dark brown. Mr. Monaghan, who was assisting the coroner, asked Mr. Wilkes, quote, "You saw that the body had what can be fairly described as blue-grey eyes." Mr. Wilkes, quote, "They were blue." On further questioning, it was revealed that in 1939 a signed statement from Sergeant King was missing. In the statement was, according to Sergeant Wilkes, words to the effect of, "I have seen the body and it is not Linda Agostini."
Did you know you can access our references, show notes, and read more about the cases we investigate over on our website? Visit ezramagazine.com/the title of the episode to view associated images, references, and links to deep dive into the episodes just like we did.
Approaching its 3rd week, public pressure to identify the body was mounting in the inquest. Additional Victorian police were called in to man the entrance to the city morgue on Batman Avenue in Melbourne. Crowds gathered outside shouting and leering. One paper described it as fanatical. Over the following few days, over 30 witnesses were called, each with their own retelling of events leading up until 1934. Due to conflicting statements, forgotten dates, and memories, yet another post-mortem autopsy was scheduled for the following Monday on the 17th of April 1944, just under 10 years since the woman's brutal death. With teeth removed, holes repaired, hair combed, skin painted, and head altered, the condition of the body was deteriorating. On the day after the post-mortem autopsy, it was revealed in the inquest that the medical examiners had removed an eye to, quote, "test for colour." Now 4 weeks into the inquest, and after hearing 65 witnesses, the medical examiners provided a report following a 2-day autopsy into the inquest. Quote, "Age 27 or 28, head injuries were caused before death and could have caused death itself. Eye colour, brown. Bullet did not cause death. Head injuries could not have been caused by a body falling 10 to 12 feet down the stairs." End statement. In closing statements by all sides, it was revealed that a report from a Sergeant King who examined the body at Sydney University was still missing. Furthermore, in support of Mrs. Routledge, Mr. Barry argued that New South Wales Police handled the case in a, quote, "highly incompetent manner." Mr. Barry continued to address the inquest. Quote, "It was appalling," he said, "that when citizens had gone along to the Sydney University to try to do their duty and recognised the body, it had been hauled out of a bath of formaldehyde in a condition which must have raised horror in the breasts of most people." While there had been no justification for all the witnesses, who could have been able to recognise the body as Linda Agostini, being brought along together and more or less told outright that the official view was that it was Mrs. Agostini, it was indefensible on all grounds that the hair of the body was set and the face creamed and the lips coloured. If the body had been got up in any way to resemble Linda Agostini, the police had no right to do it. The proper method was to submit the body unadorned. Once again adjourned, the inquest would have its final verdict on the 2nd of May 1944, where the coroner would identify the body as that of Mrs. Linda Agostini and commit Antonio Agostini for murder. However, due to the complexities of Australian law at the time, the coroner's finding that the Pyjama Girl was Mrs. Agostini was not conclusive in law. Therefore, the 65 witnesses that were called to the coroner's inquest would also be summoned to appear before the Supreme Court for the trial of Antonio Agostini the following month. Presided by Justice Lowe, the trial of Antonio Agostini reflected much of the same questions at the inquest. The deceased woman, however, would be referred to as Mrs. Agostini. The trial of Agostini was held in the Victorian Supreme Court, with special arrangements made for Justice Lowe due to the overwhelming publicity of the case at the time. However, the trial reflected more of Linda Agostini's drinking habits, suicide attempts, and how Antonio, quote, tried to save her from the bottle. Quote, "It is reported from Melbourne that women in the public galleries wept as Antonio Agostini, 41, today told the criminal court that in 1929, before his marriage to Linda Platt, he found the latter with her head in the oven of a gas stove." Agostini, who was now charged with the murder of his wife, added, "I forced the door, took her in my arms, and carried her to the bedroom window. When she had revived, she told him that she had tried to commit suicide because she had been carrying on with a Miss Cole, who was one of the guests at a party where the incident occurred." He said that his wife had a preference for whiskey, and after the first 6 months of their married life, her behaviour gradually deteriorated. Agostini said he was awakened by the alarm clock at 7 a.m. As the bell was ringing, he felt a hard object pressed against his head. Realising it was a gun, he grasped his wife's arm. Quote, "I was surprised at my wife's strength, and we struggled for a while, and as I thought I was getting better of the struggle, a shot rang out. She went limp. I saw she had been shot somewhere near the right ear." What many newspapers at the time failed to mention was the Crown prosecution relying solely on circumstantial evidence. The only evidence they had against Agostini was the signed statement by New South Wales Commissioner Mackay. During the trial, it was also revealed how it came to be that Antonio Agostini revealed his statement to Mr. Mackay. On March 4, Antonio Agostini said he received a message to go to Mr. Mackay's office. In the office, Mr. Mackay said, quote, "You don't look like the smiling Tony I used to know years ago. You seem to have a heavy weight on your mind." Mr. Mackay then asked Agostini if he had heard from his wife. He then told Agostini that detectives were about to arrest him for the murder of Linda Agostini. Mr. Mackay then continued, "You must tell me before it is too late. You can only be charged with manslaughter and get 2 years at the most. You must tell me, you may hang." Mr. Mackay said Agostini could trust him. They had another whiskey, and he started to tell Mr. Mackay how his wife was killed. Apparently, he had difficulty in recollecting all the facts, and Mr. Mackay helped him by calling things to his memory. He then had another whiskey, and he finally completed and signed the statement, which was a true account of what had happened. Agostini said he had never abused his wife, but always tried to reason with her, and when she had one of her good days, she was wonderful. He loved her too much to be angry. Agostini also said that he did not call a doctor because although his first impression was to get help, his next was that his wife was beyond all human aid. After testimony from Agostini and dozens of witness testimonies, jurors had made their decision and reached a verdict on the 29th of June. Mr. Antonio Agostini was convicted not of murder, but of manslaughter. In passing his sentence, Justice Lowe said, "You have been found guilty by a jury after a long and painstaking trial of the crime of manslaughter. In that verdict, I think the jury were merciful to you. The jury, by that verdict, have negatived any intention on your part to kill your wife or to inflict upon her grievous bodily harm. They have also rejected your account that she was accidentally killed. There remains the barely conceivable case of manslaughter from criminal negligence on your part. suggested by me to the jury in an attempt to interpret the closing remarks of your counsel to the jury and the much more probable case of death caused by assault committed by you upon her. The first alternative is, I think, so absurd on the evidence before the jury that I do not think the jury could have adopted it. My view of the jury's finding is that they thought that you had been for so long sorely tried by your wife's conduct and had been at the time you attacked her, provoked to the limits of your endurance. You then attacked her, inflicting dreadful injuries upon her which caused her death. The weapon you used must have been a heavy one, and it must have been used with great violence. Such conduct constitutes a serious crime. I have considered all that your counsel has urged. I bear in mind the good character which has been testified to by many witnesses and the long time that has elapsed since the crime was committed and the effect of that lapse of time upon you. Even so, the punishment must be severe. The sentence of this court is that you be imprisoned for a term of 6 years with hard labour. Agostini's sentencing of 6 years was relatively short in comparison to the 15 years he could have received. Furthermore, the reduction from murder to manslaughter by the jury was due to what is called provocation, a now non-existent defence. In the state of Victoria, where the alleged killing occurred, provocation may be used as a defence if there is evidence of the victim provoking the attacker. According to the Australian Law Reform Commission, the law at the time was as follows, quote, "Murder will be reduced to manslaughter if the act which caused death was done in the heat of passion, involving a loss of self-control which was caused by provocation sufficient to deprive an ordinary person of self-control." Provocation was developed as a defence in recognition of the psychological reactions which may be set in motion by the behaviour of the deceased. The law recognises that the behaviour of the deceased can be such that it would cause a reasonable or ordinary person to lose self-control. According to a journal article published in 2010 that critically analysed the law of provocation, provocation can be traced back to the 17th century, when the criminal law distinguished between a killing where there was a proof of malice afterthought and an unpremeditated killing on the spur of the moment following a provocative act. In both the United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand and Australia, it was often used as a defence by men who had found that their wife had committed adultery and had killed them thereafter. In one case, a man even said to the court, "If I couldn't have her, no one could." In 1946, a case in the UK entitled Holmes versus the Public Prosecutor, Holmes told the court that he had killed his wife during the night in the kitchen. The prior evening to the killing, he had telephoned a woman who lived in a different part of the country and with whom he had sexual relations that she might expect him on the Sunday or Monday. He travelled on the Monday to the woman's home and told her that his wife had left him. In fact, his wife's dead body was discovered the next day in the room where he had killed her. Her body showed many hammer bruises, but the final cause of death was manual strangulation. Holmes's story was that there had been a quarrel on the Saturday night arising from some persons winking in his wife's direction in a public house that evening, and a quarrel ensued, culminating in her saying, quote, "Well, if it will ease your mind, I have been untrue to you," and she went on, "I know I have done wrong, but I have no proof that you haven't at Mrs. X's place." According to Holmes, he then lost his temper, picked up a hammer and struck her with it. After a convulsive struggles, he saw that she was too far gone to do anything and he put hands around her neck until she stopped breathing. He was found guilty of manslaughter and not murder due to the common law of provocation. Holmes's case was also referred to in South Australia by the High Court in 1977. A man called Michelle Moffa killed his wife in circumstances referred to as legally provocative. On the night of August 21st, his wife allegedly rejected him sexually and wanted the relationship to end. She also allegedly expressed pleasure in cheating on him with neighbouring men and said she was going to leave him, so he killed her. Due to South Australia's laws at the time, his original conviction of murder was reduced to manslaughter by way of the common law of provocation. In Agostini's case, his charge was reduced from murder to manslaughter because the jury had reason to believe he acted suddenly and in hot blood, provoked by his wife, similar to both Holmes and Moffat. Agostini refused to claim his wife's body for burial. When the Pyjama Girl was finally laid to rest on Friday, July 14, 1944, there were no mourners present, only a crowd of curious onlookers. In a bleakly fitting touch, 4 journalists acted as pallbearers. Agostini served 4 years of a 6-year sentence in Pentridge Jail. In February of 1948, he was informed by police that he was to be deported back to Italy. In an interview, Agostini said it was, quote, greatly unfair, and he continued to say that I don't want to go back to Italy. At 3 a.m. on Saturday, August 21st, 1948, quote, the Pyjama Girl killer Antonio Agostini was taken aboard the liner Strathfinnur in police custody. The liner sailed yesterday for Genoa and Britain, but Agostini was hurried aboard in the dead hours of Saturday morning to avoid photographers. Agostini would go on to remarry, and he eventually died in 1969. Grief and loss became embedded in the psyche of the Australian citizen during the 1930s and 1940s. Remnants of World War I and the Great Depression embedded themselves within the social fabric of society. Families became scattered as people left home in search of work, family, and friends. Life in 1930s Australia was repressed socially and culturally, and the public's obsession with the Pyjama Girl case was more than likely a release of fear and anxiety. It was something for the public to focus on, even though it was a murder which disrupts the ebb and flow of a community. From the several weeks of research I conducted, I was blown away at the dramatisation of the case. As I mentioned a few times in this episode, almost, if not all major newspapers around Australia covered the story from start to finish. Adelaide's newspaper at the time, The News, the Argus in Victoria, the Sydney Morning Herald, and papers in Tasmania and Perth were, for use of a better word, obsessed with the Pyjama Girl case. Not only were the papers obsessed with her identity, but they also commented on the role of a woman in society at the time. Remembering abortions were illegal, one paper's headline very clearly stated, "No indication of illegal operation." Furthermore, speculation of her social class in Australia also graced newspaper headlines. With the absence of dirt under her fingernails, peroxided hair, and lacued nails, it was assumed by the media that she most likely belonged to a, quote, respectable family. One thing left out of the newspaper commentary was the disregard for her peace after death. Not only was her body put on public display for so many years, her body was tampered with, prodded, and even had her eye removed. The respect for her body was next to none. Furthermore, if the body does belong to that of Linda Agostini, the question then remains, where is Anna Philomena Morgan? In a poem from John Halliday, the Pyjama Girl case is surmised perfectly. In September 1934, there came a problem to the law. A body of a girl was found, and all the world it did astound. Called her the Pyjama Girl, since the police could not unfurl the mystery of this shocking case. Her name they cannot even trace. Though 10 years 'tis no more, and still a problem for the law. And now, in 1944, while we, unfortunately, at war, the case again has come to light, and after many years of quiet. And in the court, as we all know, argues police and Dr. Benbow, whether she be Philomena or the married Agostini. Whilst being held this long inquest, an Italian waiter they arrest. 'Tis very sad when now we read, Professor, Doctor, they proceed to carve the body as a dog, the body that belongs to God. They cut the face, skull to chin, knives cut deep the sacred skin, plucked her eyes from sockets numb, took the teeth from out her gum. Eyes of God are watching on, whilst the soul has passed beyond. But why preserve the solemn dead in a bath, a watery bed, on exhibit such a time, whilst they try to solve the crime? The guilty one, who it may be, who on this earth still is free, when their soul is called away, by the Maker thence shall pay. So bury now the body deep, and let her poor soul restfully sleep.